3 years and 11 months ago, I was flabbergasted. I've been watching the US presidential race very closely and assumed, like the opinion polls had predicted, that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in to win. Surely people would vote for her. Surely no one could possibly vote for Donald Trump. Could they? Well, how wrong I was. How wrong many of us were. And we know, almost 4 years later, the rest is history. I had been presumptuous. I presumed I understood what was going on and how people would vote, but of course, I was very wrong. And Jesus gives a parable this weekend to people like me who were presumptuous, but in fact were very wrong about their position in the world. We hear Jesus gives a parable about people invited to a wedding feast who refuse to come, and so instead the host, the king, invites other people from the highways and byways in their place. Last week we heard the story of the tenants of a vineyard who refused to give the owner the due produce, and so they were kicked out and others were taken in their place. And the week before that we heard a very simple parable of two sons, one of whom says, "Yes, Father, I will go work for you," but doesn't go, and the other who says, "No, I won't," but in the end does go. All three of those parables fit together. And what's important is we hear who Jesus addresses these parables to. Jesus isn't speaking to the crowds of people, to the great unwashed mass. No, Jesus speaks to the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders, those who presumed that they were the favoured ones. They were the ones invited to the wedding feast. And we hear the first reading today, an image of the wedding feast as the banquet of heaven, an image of being in God's favour. They presumed that because they had worked out the laws, they had worked out certain ritual actions to do, that they were the ones who were in God's favour, that they knew how things would work. But Jesus upends all of that. Jesus shows how, because their hearts were open, they in fact were closed off to God, and they were the ones who would end up being kicked out. And others who had never thought themselves worthy of God's favour, the great unwashed masses, the notable sinners, etc., were the ones who in the end would be invited in. So what does that mean for us today? This is a parable really spoken in a very particular context of particular Jewish leadership. What does that mean for us today? Well, it can mean two different things depending where we see ourselves. If we see ourselves as people who really aren't worthy of God, if this is the first time you've ever watched a religious video because someone sent this to you, if this is the first time you've ever gone to church, or you're just on the edge of the church feeling your way in thinking, I'm not good enough to be here, I've done too much wrong, God couldn't possibly love me, then Jesus' message is for you to say, guess what? You're going to be invited in. You are going to be welcome. And the good news for you, if you're that person, is that God never stops inviting, never stops calling. God never closed the door on you. God always wants to invite you in. But chances are, if you're like me, you might consider yourself one of those people who's kind of worked it out. That you're a good religious person, you're trying your best, and therefore, isn't that enough? If I've kind of worked out a way to live a decent life, I've worked out a bit of a pattern of prayer, I go to mass, I do the right things, isn't that enough? Do I need to keep growing and changing and working hard on this? What's the point? The point is that Jesus shows people like this are the ones who are going to end up on the outside. And I find that such a challenge for me. I like to think that after 30 years of seriously striving to be a Christian and follow Jesus, after 21 years of being a priest, that I've kind of worked it out. I feel like I should be at a plateau where I don't have to do anything new or different or harder. But that's completely wrong. That's selfishness. In fact, it's pride to think that the way I'm doing things is all I'll ever need. Our lives and the world keep on changing. The world becomes more complicated. Who could have predicted a year ago the COVID-19 world we'd be living in and the new complex problems and challenges that brings up for us in our own personal lives as well as in the wider church and the wider world? So we have to be capable of changing our practice. If I relied on being able to go to Mass every day or every week and receiving communion is the only way to be holy, of course the lockdown for coronavirus threw all that in the air, and I had to learn how to do things differently. Could I find my way to God in a quieter way? Could I make use of the time of being home to pray in a more contemplative, meditative way? Did I learn to pray with other people perhaps? These are the new challenges, and who knows what next year and the year after and the decade after might hold for us. None of us do. And so the challenge is for us to realize that none of us have ever fully arrived. There is always a need for ongoing conversion. That's a phrase that we use a lot in the church. Ongoing conversion. No matter how far we've travelled in our Christian life, no matter how good we are, no matter how close we already are to God, there is always more. I went on retreat a couple of weeks ago, thinking I was doing pretty well. I'd had a decent year, but God showed me some new things. God showed me some blindnesses, which are quite personal, so I'm not going to share them with you now, but showed me some things I've been blind about, patterns and habits of sin and neglect that have actually been going over quite a few years that God showed me and challenged me to grow and change through. So I went to reconciliation to a lovely, wise, holy old priest at the retreat centre, which was a wonderful way of resetting and starting afresh. We need to keep on doing this. This parable Jesus tells us, and the last 3 parables we've heard on Sundays, are an invitation for us who think we're already in God's favour. Indeed, we are. God loves us. But it doesn't mean we can ever rest on our laurels. There is always more openness we need to have. More growth, more change is always possible. It's always needed. And this means that we will never be the ones who get kicked out of the wedding feast, kicked out of the vineyard, or told we're on the outside. If we who already accepted God's invitation of love can keep on saying a constant new yes to God and God's love and Jesus' call to ensure we are with him right to the very end.